So, my negatives came back, and I was giddy. I was bouncing off the walls with excitement because I could actually see something in the negatives, which meant that, number one, the camera worked, and number two, I didn't mess it up so badly that everything was completely blown out or underexposed. So that was really good news, and I will show you some of what the results were at the end of this video. But first, I thought I would take a minute and address a couple of questions that I had going into this that I couldn't really find great answers for online. Maybe because the answers were so simple and obvious that I shouldn't have really needed them, but I guess I was being that cautious about this process. Question number one, how does this camera work? Well, that might seem like a really simplistic question, but I've been shooting long enough to know that just because I understand one camera doesn't automatically mean I'm going to intuitively understand another camera. So I approached this project with that knowledge in mind, thinking I can't assume that I know how this camera is going to function. And here are a few tips about shooting on the camera that I shot on, and shooting on film a little bit about how these cameras work. Number one, manual settings only. There are no automatic settings on this camera, so if that's something you're relying on or that you're used to using, you're going to have to overcome that as you approach shooting with at least this particular type of film camera. Number two, it still uses a shutter and an aperture, of course. Again, this is super simple, and I didn't really question whether that would be the case. I just didn't know how those things would be controlled. Well, it turns out that on this camera, the controls for the shutter and the aperture are different from any other camera that I've used. And the reason, I think, is because there are two lenses, and it has to control both of those simultaneously. Same with the focus. You don't want one lens to be focused differently from the other lens, or else you won't be able to achieve that stereoscopic vision or image that you're looking for, right? Similarly, you don't want your exposure to be different on one side than the other, or your shutter speed, or your depth of field, any of that. That should all be the same. And so on this camera, rather than having dials or knobs or wheels on the lenses, what they have is little levers or sliders on the top of the camera, sort of in that bridge in between the two lenses. And when you adjust one of them, it adjusts that same attribute on both lenses simultaneously. Another one, the light sensitivity is a property of the film you're using, not a property of the camera itself. So if you're used to shooting digital, you might be used to adjusting your ISO setting in order to make your image sensor more or less sensitive to light. And of course, you'll introduce grain or noise that way when you raise your ISO, and it has other effects. But when you're shooting on film, that's a property of the film. And how much noise or grain is in the image depends on what film stock you use. If it has a higher speed, meaning a higher ISO rating, then you're going to get more noise and more sensitivity. It works basically the same way as it does with digital cameras, but it's not something you can adjust in between shots. You have to stick with the same ISO for the entire roll of film. And so that means you have to choose a roll of film for the conditions you're going to be shooting in. Now, I shot on an ISO 400 film, and that's a pretty decent film for available light conditions, whether I'm shooting outdoors as I did for one of these rolls, or indoors as I did for another one. It's a pretty flexible ISO rating. You can, however, get much lower ratings and also much higher ratings. So you're going to want to choose the one you want for the needs. That means that you have to think ahead a little bit about what am I going to be shooting, and make sure that you bring the film with you that is appropriate for that environment and those conditions. Another thing about how this camera works, this is not an SLR camera. It is a viewfinder-based camera. So what that means is, as I look through the viewfinder, I'm actually seeing through a little lens in between the two lenses that are used to capture the image. That's going to approximate the view that those lenses have, but it's not going to perfectly replicate it. And more importantly, if you're used to being able to do this with digital cameras, you cannot see whether or not your picture is in focus just by looking through the viewfinder. So you're going to have to think about the actual distance between the camera and the subject, and then use the markings on the sides of the lenses to try to figure out exactly where to set the focus based on the distance that you have between your camera and your subject, not just looking through the lens and adjusting your focus. And in general, that's a principle that applies to film cameras. Now, if you're working with an SLR camera, even a film SLR, you may be able to do this, but this particular camera doesn't have that function. Similarly, you're not going to be able to take test shots to figure out your exposure because you can't see your picture as soon as you take it. Again, that's not a new concept for me with film, but it is one of the ones you constantly have to have in mind while you're shooting on film. You have to remind yourself, I'm not going to be able to just click and look and adjust. I'm going to have to plan this shot a lot more carefully than I would if I were shooting digital. Next question, what kind of film can I use with this camera? This might seem like a super obvious question, but it's one that I genuinely had. I just doubted my own knowledge enough to feel assured that I could pick the right film stock just by picking anything up. This camera is capable of shooting on anything in the 35mm size, right? Any 35mm film will work in this camera. Does that mean they'll all work equally well? Well, I mean, I haven't tested all of them, you know? I've only used one film stock so far, and I'm gonna be trying different ones and seeing how they go. But theoretically, any 35mm film will work here. However, what I would recommend doing is see if you can go online or go into a photography shop, if there's one within easy reach for you, and see if you can look at examples of what the photography from different film stocks look like. You can go on various websites to read about what each film stock is made for, and then you can look at sort of what pictures on that film stock look like, or what their potential is, right? And that'll give you an idea of sort of what to expect, because every film stock has different properties. Not only an ISO rating, as I said before, but they're going to handle contrast differently. If you're shooting in color, you're going to handle color differently. So you're going to want to maybe do a little research into film stocks. But that's part of the fun, right? Figuring things out and figuring out how to use not just the camera, but also the particular film stock that you've chosen. Okay, last few questions, and I'm going to do these ones pretty quickly. First of all, how do I make sure my exposure is right if I can't see the picture? Well, your new best friend is a light meter. And there's a couple of different types you can get. You can get a dedicated meter with hardware, or you can get one that is an app for your phone. And your mileage may vary with those. I have used both approaches in my testing, and I've gotten similar results from them. So that's encouraging. I'm going to take a look more closely at those in another video later on. Explore light meters a little bit more, but that's something that I didn't have much experience with, really any experience with before. I'd never used a light meter before this project, especially with digital technology where there's other metering tools such as your histogram or your false color or things like that. Those are my go-to tools for measuring exposure. But on film, the light meter has been critical. And the way a light meter works is you either point it at your subject or stand where your subject is and point it at your light source, depending on how you're using it, and you put in your film's ISO rating to the meter, and depending on what the meter is, maybe some other information, and it will give you a range of values, a range of shutter speeds and aperture settings to use in order to achieve your exposure based on what you've told the meter you're looking for. Again, I'll explore that in greater detail, but it's an essential tool. Next question, how many shots am I going to get out of one roll of film? This is a question that's more specific to stereo cameras, because in a regular 35mm camera, if there's 36 exposures on a roll, I can expect to get 36 pictures out of that roll. But the stereo camera works a little differently. It doesn't use the full frame, it uses maybe a little over half of the frame for each side of the image, for the left exposure and then again for the right exposure. And they're not the same frame, they're offset. So if you take a look at these negatives, for example, you can see I've got repeated images, one from the left lens and one from the right lens of the same scene. Those were captured at the same time, and then when you advance the film, you move down a little ways and it does another set of offset images. Well, because of the way that works, you actually get twice as many exposed frames as the times that you clicked the shutter button, because there's 2 for each image, but you also use a little more than half of each frame for each one, so you don't get the full 36 images. I ended up getting 31 to 32 pictures out of each 36 frame roll film. So approximately 95% of the film's stated capacity, I think, is what you can expect to get out of it. And the last question that I'd like to answer briefly is, what kind of pictures can I expect from this camera? Well, that is a hugely variable question, but it was one that I had going in. And what I meant by that was, what can I expect in terms of things like sharpness or contrast or image quality in general? Some of that's going to boil down to what film stock you use. Some will have higher grain or finer grain, finer details will be visible on different film stocks. But also a lot depends on how well the camera that you're using has been maintained. Mine is about 70 years old, and it doesn't have any visible defects in terms of the lenses. There's no scratches or anything. I can't detect any problems with the camera itself. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't problems that I can't easily see. So I had to do some testing, and what I discovered is, unsurprisingly, the pictures from this older camera look just like pictures from an older camera. They're maybe not as sharp as I might have expected, but they are still acceptably sharp. Both of the lenses have a pretty wide angle, and they also have a relatively long minimum focal distance, so I can't get any extremely shallow depth of field, but I can get some really great deep field when it comes to these shots. Also, the aspect ratio of these images is different. As I showed you on the negatives before, they are taller than they are wide, and that's normal for this type of camera, but it's not necessarily standard for a regular 35mm film camera. Again, a 35mm frame is generally a different ratio, but these, because of the way they're set up for the stereo images, you have a tall, thin aspect ratio rather than a long, wide one. All right, so those are a few questions that I had going into this project, and I hope that my answering them for you might have helped you. And now let's take a look at some of the results of my shoot. Alright, so what's next after this video? Well, I've got a few other videos planned. Like I said, I'm going to do a walkthrough of the particular camera, the Kodak Stereo Camera, for those of you who may have that particular camera. I'm also going to do a video about light meters and things like that. But as far as the actual project goes, I'm just continuing to shoot right now. I'm trying, now that I know the camera works, I'm trying some more varied conditions to shoot in. And I'm going to get a few more rolls developed, and once I've done that, then I'm going to get some high quality scans done and try to print these off and create some stereographs to use. I have access to an old stereoscope viewer, and I'm going to see if I can actually create these images with the 3D effect. So that's where we're going from here. Thanks for watching.